On the afternoon of December 7th, 1941, the heart of the American naval fleet in the Pacific lay sinking, burning, shattered, and destroyed in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor on Oahu, Hawaii. The devastating Japanese raid that began at 7:55 that morning left 19 ships damaged or sunk, 188 American aircraft destroyed, and over 2,300 people dead. Of the ships sunk in the Pearl Harbor attack, many people can name the most famous one, the USS Arizona, whose wreck remains on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, still slowly leaking oil now 80 years after the disaster. But there was another battleship sunk in the attack with a story that is less well known. The USS California was at the very head of Battleship Row, anchored off Ford Island, and she was badly hit by Japanese torpedoes and bombs. Though not totally destroyed the way Arizona was, she was still in pretty horrible shape, and on that first afternoon of America's official involvement in the Second World War, there was a serious question whether California's life as a fighting ship was over for all time. This video is the story of that ship, what happened to her before, during, and after Pearl Harbor, and what it can tell us about the naval history of World War II. I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian, author, podcaster, and teacher. I teach history courses online at my website, seanmunger.com, including a free class on the Pearl Harbor attack specifically. The USS California, the ship designated BB-44 in the U.S. Navy records, had a fascinating life. You'll usually hear of her somewhere in the list of ships that were casualties in the Pearl Harbor attack. There were many casualties aboard the California, and 4 U.S. servicemen were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions taken aboard her. That is a big deal. You might also hear of her mentioned in connection with the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, or other engagements in which she took part. But the simple phrase California was a battleship in World War II, although technically true, kind of distorts her history a little bit, and in this video, we're going to take a deeper look. The interesting thing about the California's story, and what often gets missed, is that the vast majority of her life and career predated World War II. She was in fact built for an entirely different world, and an entirely different purpose than the world she found herself in on December 7th. In many ways, that's the most important thing about the California and her story. A little later in the video, I'll tell you why I became interested in this ship specifically, but let's start not with Pearl Harbor, not even with World War II, but rather how California started her life and what she was built to do. USS California was 9th in a series of 12 battleships called the Standard Type battleships, built by the United States between 1912 and 1920. There were 5 classes of battleships, each named after the first one in the series: Nevada, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Colorado. California, laid down in 1916 and launched in 1919, was the last of the Tennessee class, which was very similar to the New Mexico class. Why was the United States building battleships in the 19-teens? Well, all the great powers, or countries that wanted to be great powers, were doing it, or trying to. Way back in 1906, the British had revolutionized naval ship design with their battleship, which has far and away the coolest name in naval history, Dreadnought. I mean, honestly, how cool is that? Britain and Germany were engaged in a ferocious arms race in the years before World War I. In fact, the naval arms race was one of the causes of World War I. Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, was a great believer in having a strong navy. Under him, the U.S. Navy was supposed to get 2 new battleships a year, which was thought to be needed because battleship design was becoming more advanced all the time, and of course we had to have all the latest gadgets. By 1912, though, when Woodrow Wilson was elected, Congress was getting tired of keeping up with the Joneses and buying the Navy new ships all the time, so they asked for a standardization of battleship design, hence the name Standard Design. Oh, there could and would be variations, but basically these ships would have 12 really big guns, a whole bunch of smaller guns, and armored plating throughout. By the time California was authorized by Congress in March 1915, a few new design tweaks had been made since the previous battleship class had worked its way through the system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how many guns she had and what calibers they were. That stuff is very interesting, but I'm more of a bigger picture kind of guy. If you do want that, naval history YouTuber Drakinifel has a great video on the California that goes through all the technical specs. I highly recommend it. 1916, the year construction began on California, was right in the middle of World War I. At the very end of May of that year, the epic end-of-the-world duel between the two largest navies, Britain's and Germany's, got going in the waters up north of Denmark, the Battle of Jutland. Hold that thought, I'm going to come back to Jutland in a little bit. California, fitting her name, was built on the west coast at Mare Island Navy Yard in Vallejo, California. Construction took a long time. World War I was over by the time she was finished. California was launched on November 20th, 1919, and Mrs. Barbara Zane did the honors, the champagne bottle and all of that. She was the daughter, incidentally, of California's governor, William Stevens. USS California was commissioned on August 10, 1921. Her first captain was Henry J. Ziegemeyer, and she was quite a thing to look at. State-of-the-art for her time, the proud flagship of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And at the time, there were 4 more battleships building, which would soon be in service. Teddy Roosevelt's dream of a strong, invincible U.S. battle fleet that no power on Earth would challenge was fulfilled. Right? Not exactly. From the get-go, California was a victim of poor timing. The program that gave rise to her and the other battleships in the fleet she joined was hot in 1912, the height of the naval arms race in Europe, only 6 years after the Dreadnought debuted, when it looked to all the top Navy strategists in the world like battleships were the future of naval and military power. But in the time it took to build those 12 battleships, there was a world war, which greatly affected the global naval balance of power. In fact, after the war, the victorious Allied powers sought to ensure peace in part by limiting armaments, including battleships. In 1922, before California's new car smell had even worn off, the United States signed the Washington Naval Treaty, which strictly limited the number, size, and armament of ships that the signatory powers were allowed to build. In fact, the 11th battleship in the Standard Series, the USS Washington, which was under construction at the time the treaty was signed, was basically thrown away as a result of this treaty. The Navy towed her out to sea and used her for target practice. 2 other things happened during World War I that were important to California's fate. Remember I mentioned that big battle in 1916 called Jutland? This was supposed to be the big world-shaking duel, the ultimate cage match battle between the German and British navies that would decide the fate of the world. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out that way. It's not really clear who won the Battle of Jutland. Both the British and the Germans achieved some, but not all, of their objectives. Both lost some, but not all of their ships. Historians and Navy buffs can argue about who quote-unquote won, but for our purposes, let's just say that the battle did not validate a lot of the theories that British, American, and German admirals had been thinking up for nearly 30 years by that point about how naval power was supposed to operate and what it was supposed to achieve. The second thing that happened was that after the somewhat disappointing frolic at Jutland, the Germans were pretty reluctant to send their fleet out again to tangle with the British. Aside from their submarines, which were a different story, the Germans held back their surface fleet for the most part during the rest of the war in order to keep the fleet intact. In early 1919, after the armistice ended the war, the Germans deliberately sank their fleet at Scapa Flow in Scotland rather than turn their expensive ships over to the Allies. What this showed is that battleships were so expensive and such a huge commitment of resources for a country that political and military leaders were kind of scared to risk them in battle. One bad day out there on the ocean could ruin decades worth of military and economic resources. Could this mean that battleships as a type of weapon were actually far less effective in practice than they were supposed to be? The mere thought is heresy, but keep it in mind. Wait, Dr. Munger, isn't this supposed to be a video about the USS California? Well, it is. I am talking about the California, because all of this gets us to the question, what does a new, big, sparkling, state-of-the-art battleship actually spend its time doing when there's not a war on? The answer to that question is the story of California's career, up until 7:50 a.m. on December 7, 1941. Mostly what the California did in this period, at least when she wasn't attending reviews and inspections, was to take part in drills and elaborate war games. Between 1923 and the outbreak of World War II, the Navy held 21 major drills, which they called fleet problems, simulating various war situations. For example, in February 1931, the California participated in Fleet Problem 12, where part of the U.S. Navy pretended to be an enemy force attacking the Panama Canal. A lot of these fleet problems involved the Panama Canal. Many also involved a military problem that was consuming the Navy at this time. how traditional surface forces, like battleships, would do against enemies that used carrier-launched aircraft. This was sort of a double-edged sword. In the 1920s and 30s, aircraft carriers were primitive, slow, guzzled fuel like crazy, and had a limited range. Battleships could still do reasonably well against these kinds of carrier forces. As the years wore on, though, this started to change. Fleet Problem 14, which took place in early 1933, simulated an enemy launching carrier attacks against the U.S. West Coast. The defensive fleet slowed down the simulated enemy, but they still managed to bomb, theoretically, San Francisco and other California cities. This and other fleet problems seemed to translate into advice for the U.S. Navy planning people. Guess what? We need more aircraft carriers. But this was the height of the Depression. It was tough getting money out of Congress for what a lot of old guard officers regarded as a bunch of whiz-bang type of stuff. The rise of carrier tactics should not have been a surprise. In 1921, the year California made her debut, U.S. Army Colonel Billy Mitchell, a tireless advocate of air power, convinced the Army and Navy to let him do a demonstration of how planes could easily destroy big naval assets like battleships. In his demonstration, Mitchell's ground-based air forces actually blew up a couple of old German battleships. The military brass and President Warren Harding were severely inconvenienced by the results of these tests. Most everybody still believed that the future of naval warfare was in big, mobile, powerful gun platforms, exactly what battleships were supposed to be. Billy Mitchell was even court-martialed in 1925 for speaking out too strongly that the Army and Navy were pissing away national defense by not concentrating more on air power. No one wanted to admit the truth, that battleships weren't really a good investment of defense resources anymore, or perhaps even worse, that they were, I can't even say it, the O word. The only thing that could prove Mitchell's theories right was another war, which he strongly believed was coming, despite everybody else saying that World War I, then called the Great War, was the war to end all wars. So anyway, the California spent the first 20 years of its service life, which was the vast majority of her career, participating in these kinds of war games and fleet problems. She also lent humanitarian aid in various emergency situations. For example, by deploying a bunch of sailors ashore to help relief forces in the aftermath of a major earthquake in Long Beach in March 1933. The last of the fleet problems, number 21, was the reason why California wound up in Pearl Harbor at the time of the Japanese attack. Much of the Pacific Fleet, which at the time was headquartered in San Diego, was temporarily based out of Pearl Harbor just for the duration of that war game. However, when Fleet Problem 21 ended in early May 1940, about the same time as Hitler's attack on France, the War Department ordered the Pacific Fleet to not come back to San Diego. They would be based out of Pearl Harbor from now on. This was done to deter the Japanese from trying to attack Dutch and French colonies in Southeast Asia, eventually orphaned by the fall of Holland and France to Nazi forces. No fleet problems occurred in 1941. They were canceled for fear of provoking the Japanese. California took a trip to San Francisco in April 1941 for an overhaul. Then she came back to Hawaii and was usually moored in her traditional place, right in the front of the line on Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor. Before we get to Pearl Harbor, I promised I'd tell you how I became interested in the USS California specifically. It has to do with one of my all-time favorite books, The Winds of War by Herman Wouk, published in 1971, and which had an epic TV miniseries made from it in 1983, which I remember watching as a kid. And yes, it features a reenactment of the Pearl Harbor attack, which was actually filmed on December 7th, 1981, exactly 40 years after the event. I love this book, and I reread it about every other year. You can see that it's my copy's held together with packing tape. Anyway, one of the main characters of the book is a U.S. Navy captain, Victor Henry, Pug he's called, who was played in the film by Robert Mitchum, miscast in my opinion. In October 1941, at the culmination of his Navy career, President Franklin Roosevelt pulls some strings and gets Pug Henry assigned to command a battleship, the USS California. He's on his way to take command when, bam, the attack happens, totally ruining his career plans. And also, due to coincidentally bad timing, Pug Henry's wife decides to divorce him at exactly the same time. Of course, this is a fictional story, and Pug Henry is a fictional character. The real captain of the California at the time of the attack was Joel W.B. Bunkley, who had assumed command on December 31st, 1940. Now, he was not aboard the ship at the time the attack began. Neither, incidentally, was the executive officer, Commander Earl Stone. The senior officer on board was Lieutenant Commander Marion Little. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the California was ready for an inspection that was supposed to happen later that day. This is really unfortunate because it meant that most of her guns were not in a state of readiness. A couple of engines were offline, and worst of all, her watertight doors were open. I don't know what the captain and executive officer were away doing the previous night and that morning, but you can't really blame them. There were some warning signs of the coming attack, such as the first Japanese strike wave being picked up on radar nearly an hour before the raid, but nobody put the various pieces together and realized what was coming. When Japanese planes appeared in the skies over Pearl Harbor, ships started to go to general quarters, including the California. Commander Little ordered the guns to be made ready and preparations to get underway. Some of the guns that were ready fired back at the Japanese, but at 8:05 a.m., 2 plane-launched torpedoes struck the California, both fore and aft. This was 1 minute before the catastrophic bomb hit on the USS Arizona. When the torpedoes went off, California began sinking immediately. Commander Little ordered counter-flooding to keep the ship from turning over, but the damage was disastrous. The ship soon lost internal power. California was struck again, this time by a bomb at 8:45 a.m. This explosion blew up much of the interior of the ship and started a huge fire. Of the 4 servicemen who won the Medal of Honor for their actions on board the California, 3, Jackson Ferris, Harold Jones, and Thomas Reeves, got it for efforts they made to organize the passing out of ammunition to gun crews. Of these 3, only Ferris survived. The 4th Medal of Honor winner, Robert Scott, manned an air compressor and refused to leave his station until he drowned. There were numerous other acts of valor aboard the California that morning. In no way was it limited to these 4. On the whole, the crew performed heroically. A total of 98 people aboard California were killed in the attack and 61 wounded. By 9:15, the captain and executive officer were back on board. Everyone did what they could, but the California was a disaster area. The ship was still sinking, the water inside it was filled with oil, various interior spaces filled up with toxic gas, and fires were burning out of control. The captain gave the order to abandon ship. She took 3 days to sink fully, but the counter-flooding probably saved her. She was upright, stuck 16 feet into the mud at the bottom of the harbor, but part of the ship was above water. Of course, you know the implications of the attack. The United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The Japanese had struck a terrible blow, but they missed perhaps the most important of their objectives in the attack, the aircraft carriers, which were all away on other assignments at the time of the attack. If you're enjoying this video, I'd like you to do me a little favor. Most YouTubers say like, subscribe, share. I'm actually not going to say that. If you like this video, the best way you can help me make more videos is by watching another one of my videos right after this one. For example, I've just done one about a somewhat obscure ocean liner called the Ancona, which was torpedoed in 1915 during World War I in circumstances remarkably similar to the much more famous Lusitania disaster, but the Ancona is much less well known. So if you're into nautical history, you might enjoy that one, or check out some of the other stuff on my channel. And now, back to the California. The effort to salvage and rebuild the sunken California was part and parcel of a gigantic program of salvage and reclamation that occurred after the Pearl Harbor attack. The engineering and logistics of this program really are amazing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. History YouTuber Drakenefell again has an insanely interesting video on this subject, which I can't hope to improve on. So go there if you want more info on this. I put the link in the description. Anyway, California was raised and refloated on March 25th, 1942, but her progress was short-lived. A built-up pocket of fuel vapor oil and hydrogen sulfide gas in one of the forward compartments exploded on April 5th, causing the battleship to sink again. This time they managed to keep ahead of the flooding, and California entered a dry dock for extensive repairs. This was the first of 2 major rounds of repairs and overhaul. The second happened at Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State. California was similar to many of the other battleships that were damaged but salvageable after Pearl Harbor. They ended up sitting out most of World War II while getting repaired. It wasn't until the spring of 1944 that California, now totally rebuilt, finally took to sea in combat-ready condition. In the meantime, it was the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, principally at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, that stopped the Japanese offensive across the Pacific that began with Pearl Harbor. Battleships didn't really get into the fight in a big way until much later in the war, after arguably the major window of their usefulness had already closed. California took part in several engagements in the Pacific War. In most of them, her big guns were used to blast Japanese positions on various islands in preparation for landings there by U.S. Marines. The battles of Saipan and Tinian followed this pattern. While on this kind of duty near the island of Palau on January 6, 1945, California was hit by a Japanese kamikaze plane. The explosion killed 44 people and injured 155 more. In this phase of the war, and especially at Okinawa, kamikazes inflicted catastrophic damage on American ships. It was very difficult to defend against them. Only once did California take part in a major engagement between battleships. It was during the Philippines campaign in October 1944, and the battle, called Leyte Gulf, was fought in the waters between two of the major Philippine islands. This was the kind of high-stakes, end-of-the-world, all-out sea-powered duel that Jutland was supposed to have been in 1916, and it was the very last of this kind of battle ever to take place in world history. The United States defeated the Japanese at Leyte Gulf. California came through relatively intact. The worst damage she suffered, ironically, was in an accidental crash with the Tennessee, which happened when California's captain misinterpreted an order to turn. Landings in the Philippines, though bloody, were successful. Japan was losing the Pacific War badly. The Battle of Leyte Gulf really was the end of an era in world history, and in some ways it was kind of superfluous. The U.S. could have won the Pacific War without it. It wasn't pivotal the way, say, Midway was. The fact that all of the United States Navy's expensive battleships, which had consumed a massive amount of resources and the thinking of naval planners since the beginning of the century, the fact that they only got one chance to carry out the primary mission they were intended for, to me, that's a really startling fact. And I think it illustrates something that I'm sure many will disagree with, but that's fine, but I'm going to say it anyway. As strategic weapons, battleships were largely a failure. Jutland in 1916 wasn't decisive, and neither was Leyte Gulf in 1944. These weapons were so big and so expensive that countries rarely wanted to risk using them. In many cases, you use them, you lose them. Now, that's not to say that ships like California weren't useful in the other tasks that they did in the Pacific War. Clearly, they were. But as you recall, the possible obsolescence of battleships was proven by Billy Mitchell way back in 1921, the year California first took to sea. I sort of think of a ship like California as like a very talented actor who trains his whole life to play in the Royal Shakespeare Company, but who never gets to play Macbeth on stage and ends up working in sitcoms and bit parts in action movies. That's why the story of California is a little bit sad. After Japan surrendered in August 1945, the big battleships like California were mostly out of work. She supported American troops in the occupation of Japan, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, and put in at Philadelphia in December 1945. Most of her crew was discharged shortly afterward. California never returned to active service. She sat around in Philadelphia for a long time, technically in reserve, but officially listed as out of commission beginning in February 1947. In July 1959, what remained of this proud ship, a survivor and casualty of the Pearl Harbor attack, was sold to Bethlehem Steel Company for $860,000 and shortly cut up for scrap. Every ship has a story, and usually a highly interesting one. This was the story of the USS California, and I hope you enjoyed it. I've got more videos on nautical history. I just finished one on the SS Bremen, the German ocean liner launched in 1928. I'm also doing one on the SS Ancona, a little-known casualty of World War I, similar to the story of the Lusitania. So check out those videos if you like this one. In the meantime, visit my website, seanmunger.com, where I've got lots of cool history stuff, and thanks so much for watching.